Shattered Silence, A Journey of Survival and Healing, by Nanise Munoz, formerly Nicola Nooks. Chapter 3. The Church Argument. The End of Another Long Day. The day ended like any other. I had just returned from school after a long day. My school bag rested on the bed beside me, and the fading evening light cast long shadows across the room. I sat on the edge of my bed, my uniform slightly wrinkled from the day. Exhaustion weighed heavily on me, and it wasn't just physical. It was the burden of everything I carried inside. The thought of going to church that evening felt impossible. Not because I didn't believe in God, but because I didn't have the energy to pretend I was okay. A reluctant decision. I had recently given my life to the Lord, and since then, my mother and I rarely missed a church service. Sunday mornings, sometimes Sunday nights, and even Wednesday evenings became our routine, except for the occasional times when my mother decided we'd stay home. But that evening was different. I was exhausted, drained to my core, and I didn't have the energy to put on a mask and pretend like everything was okay. Skipping church didn't seem like a big deal to me. There had been other nights we hadn't gone, and it was always at my mother's discretion. But this time, at 18, when I decided not to go, she reacted differently. As I slipped out of my school uniform and stepped outside, she asked, "Aren't you going to church tonight?" "No, I'm not," I replied. Time passed, but the question came again. "Aren't you getting ready for church?" Each time, I gave her the same answer. "I'm not going tonight." I wasn't trying to be defiant. I just didn't feel like going. Still, something shifted in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. Tension building. She checked yet again to see if I was getting ready for church, but I stayed quiet, hoping time would slip by until it was too late for me to go. My silence didn't deter her. She was relentless, clearly determined that I needed to go, whether I felt like it or not. In her eyes, my feelings were irrelevant. I could feel she wasn't going to let it go, but I kept hoping she would. The air between us felt heavier with each passing moment. It was like standing in the moments right before a storm. Still, thick and tense. The silence was taking charge, warning of what might come next. A forced change in direction. It started with an invitation from a young lady who lived nearby. She asked me to join her at a church called Pentecostal Tabernacle, which was just a short walk from where we lived. From the moment I stepped through its doors, I felt God's presence in a way I had never experienced before. I cried through Sunday school and the service, overwhelmed by His presence, so powerful, so real, that it moved me to tears. When I returned home, I told my mother I wanted to get baptized at Pentecostal Tabernacle, but she didn't support my decision. Instead, she insisted that I attend her church. I was told we weren't going back to Pentecostal Tabernacle because of something my sister had done. I didn't know what it was, but I hadn't done anything wrong, yet I still had to face the consequences of her actions. It felt unfair, like I was being punished for something beyond my control. My heart ached, not just for the loss of the church community, but for the sense that I was being held accountable for someone else's mistake. My mother had recently started going to a new church that was still in its early days. I wasn't drawn to it, but she left me with no choice. "Where I go, you go," she said. The truth was, I didn't see her as a Christian because her actions didn't reflect the faith she claimed. How could someone who treated me the way she did call herself a Christian? The pastor of her church would sometimes visit our home, accompanied by a few members of the congregation. There was something different about the pastor, something I couldn't quite put into words. She had a light about her, a presence that was calming and genuine. Even so, my feelings about the church didn't change. In my mind, the others couldn't be much different from my mother. I believed the saying, "Birds of a feather flock together," and I wasn't eager to be a part of their group. But my mother wouldn't take no for an answer. So I went. The church was small and attached to someone's house. I hated it. Everything about it felt uninviting. But the pastor was persistent. She sat me down, asked me questions, and talked to me about giving my life to the Lord. Eventually, I became the first person baptized at that church. It wasn't where I wanted to be, but over time, I began to feel a sense of belonging. Slowly, I let myself become a part of the congregation, even if it hadn't been my choice at first. Living in the tenement yard. We lived in a tenement yard, sharing 2 connected rooms. My mother and her husband stayed in one, while my younger sister, brother, and I shared the other. My older brother had already moved out by then, leaving just the 5 of us. Two other tenants shared the yard. One was a Christian woman who lived with her daughter and grandchildren, and the other one was an older lady with two kids, and other family members do visit her occasionally and go. And there was an elderly woman who often passed through our yard to reach her own home. Privacy was non-existent. One neighbor and her family window looked directly in our front yard, and houses pressed in from every side. Some were separated by fences, others by the walls of neighboring homes. The yard was always alive with activity. Children running, doors slamming. Despite the constant movement, it was fairly quiet in its own way. It wasn't noisy. The yard reflected the world outside, intruding on my space, leaving nowhere to hide. The commotion outside mirrored the tensions brewing inside my home, a backdrop to my struggles that made everything feel more suffocating. Reflection. Struggling for peace and belonging. Looking back on that time, I see how torn I was, caught between my seeking for a connection with God and the complicated, often painful relationship I had with my mother. Church, for me, was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of refuge and strength. But my mother's insistence on taking me to her church felt more like an order than an invitation. I couldn't understand why she wouldn't support me in my spiritual choices, but at the same time, I wasn't ready to abandon my faith. Reconciling my longing for peace with the constant tension in our relationship felt impossible. I often felt like an outsider, not just at home, but even in the church that was supposed to bring me closer to God. My mother's actions seemed less about faith and more about control. It was always her way or no way, and it wore me down. I started to question whether she truly lived her faith, or if it was just another part of her routine. Her insistence on bringing me to her church didn't feel like guidance. It felt like another way to assert her authority over me. I didn't feel like a young woman growing into independence. I felt like a child being managed. Over time, my faith became something deeply personal, something that belonged to me. It wasn't easy. It took time, patience, and painful self-reflection to understand that I didn't need to follow anyone else's spiritual path but my own. The tension, the disagreements, and the struggles with my mother didn't weaken my desire for a deeper connection with God. If anything, they strengthened it. I learned that peace with God didn't always mean peace at home. That was a hard truth to accept, but it became a foundation for my spiritual growth as I got older. The conflict begins. Shattered expectations. The air was heavy with tension that night, thick and unrelenting, like the calm before a storm. What had started as an ordinary evening quickly unraveled into something far more intense. Something I couldn't have foreseen. I had decided not to go to church that night. The weight of everything I was carrying inside had left me drained, with nothing left to give. When my mother confronted me about my decision, it felt like more than just a disagreement. It was as if an invisible line had been crossed, though I couldn't quite articulate why. How could something so small, something as routine as missing one church service, spiral into a conflict that would leave me shaken? As the minutes stretched on and time passed, she stayed in the other room. There were no glances, no words. Just silence. I sat still, hoping she would realize it was getting too late to get ready and decide to let it go. Maybe, I thought, it would be over without a fight. But she didn't give up. I knew the drill. Sundays, Wednesdays, and sometimes Saturday evenings for choir practice. Church attendance wasn't required for everyone in the house. My younger sister, my little brother, and my stepfather didn't attend. But for me, it was expected. Still, tonight was different. I couldn't explain it. I don't even remember if I was tired. I just didn't want to go. I thought it would end there, a brief standoff of wills. But my mother's reaction shattered that hope, turning a moment of disagreement into something far more painful. The storm of words. When I refused to move from my spot on the bed, my mother's frustration erupted. She stormed into my room, and in a whirlwind of anger, began yanking my clothes off the hangers. For a moment, I sat frozen, paralyzed by the chaos unfolding in front of me. Her actions felt surreal, like she had lost all sense of control. This wasn't just about church. This was about power, about her need to dominate. One by one, she threw my clothes outside, scattering them across the yard, part concrete, part dirt. I stared, stunned, as my belongings lay in disarray, exposed to the elements. The sight of my life reduced to a pile of crumpled clothes and dirt-covered memories was jarring. The final blow came when she hurled my school folder onto the ground. It was the one thing that felt like a symbol of my effort and my identity. It wasn't just about the items being thrown out. It was about the message her actions carried. My choices didn't matter. I wasn't allowed the freedom to make decisions about my own life. In that moment, I felt discarded, stripped of autonomy, and left to wrestle with what it all meant. The final straw. When I retrieved my folder and placed it back on the bed, I hoped desperately that it would end there. But my mother came back, her anger unabated, and threw it outside again. This time, the gesture felt final and irreversible. It wasn't just an act of rebellion against me. It was a silent message, as clear as any words. My presence wasn't welcome. My desires and my opinions didn't matter in the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, my home. At this point, I can't remember if she explicitly told me to get out of the room or house, but her actions spoke volumes. My chest tightened, a knot of hurt and disbelief pressing against me. Slowly, I stood, letting the reality settle in, and stepped outside. The night air hit me like a wall, cool, unfamiliar, and heavy with the weight of everything left unsaid. It was unmistakable. I no longer belonged here. In that moment, I wasn't her daughter. I was an intruder, unwanted and insignificant. As I stood there, staring at the scattered remains of my belongings, the question I couldn't escape gnawed at me. Where was I supposed to go? The thought made my stomach churn. I was just a teenager, still in school, with no options, no safety net, and no place to turn. I felt utterly unmoored, as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. A recognized conflict. The shouting and commotion didn't go unnoticed. One of the tenants in the yard caught sight of what was happening. I'm not sure if anyone else behind those walls heard it, but the noise was loud enough for someone to recognize the chaos that had taken over. Another neighbor, whose window faced our front yard, witnessed the way I was treated at my mother's house, perhaps feeling the weight of it as I did. It was the tenant next door who, one afternoon while I was outside washing clothes, glanced through her window and called me by name. She wasn't one to interfere openly, but her acknowledgement felt like a fleeting comfort. "Don't worry, you'll get big soon," she said, her voice tinged with a strange mixture of empathy and helplessness. Her words, simple and brief, carried the unspoken understanding of someone who could see the injustice of my situation, but was powerless to change it. Those words lingered with me. They weren't much, a small, seemingly encouraging remark, but they were a paradox. She had no real ability to stop what was happening, yet her empathy gave me a kind of validation I hadn't realized I craved. Someone was noticing my pain, and though it was a small comfort, it didn't erase the sting of humiliation from being trapped in such an emotional storm. The idea that a neighbor, someone with no connection to our family, could see the weight of my suffering was both humbling and humiliating. I wanted to disappear from the world's gaze, to escape the scrutiny of others, but at the same time, it was oddly comforting to know I wasn't invisible. Reflection. Looking back, I see that night as more than just a family conflict. It was a moment of profound emotional upheaval. What I felt wasn't confined to rejection and confusion in that single night. It was the culmination of years of feeling dismissed and controlled. My mother's actions that evening were extreme, but my reaction was born from the weight of a lifetime of emotional neglect. The experience shook the foundations of my self-worth and left me grappling with questions I didn't know how to answer. Why was my voice so easily ignored? Why did my choices seem to matter so little? These questions lingered, haunting me. I couldn't shake the thought. Had there ever been a moment in my life when I truly felt seen, heard, and valued simply for being myself? Over the years, I've come to see that this experience wasn't just personal. It mirrors the universal struggle of seeking validation and acceptance. Scriptures like Romans 8 verse 31, "If God is for us, who can be against us?" now resonate deeply with me. They remind me that, while I felt abandoned by my mother, I was never abandoned by God. His love and validation were, and still are, the truest source of my worth. From a spiritual perspective, I now recognize that the pain I endured that night wasn't only about familial rejection. It was a step toward discovering my inherent worth in the eyes of a loving, heavenly Father. My mother's rejection, painful as it was, drove me closer to understanding that true validation doesn't come from people. It comes from God, who values us for who we are, not for what others say or do. The physical altercation. The yard seemed unnervingly still, but the air crackled with tension. Chaos had erupted to a level I never thought possible. My belongings, including clothes and personal items, had already been discarded. Their once secure place inside the house was reduced to a scattered heap in the yard. I thought that was the worst of it, but then I saw my mother again, her movements sharp and deliberate as she picked up the pile. Without hesitation, she began marching toward the gate that led to the main road. The sight froze me. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what she was about to do. The road wasn't just any street. It was a hub of activity. Bars, shops, and people filled the space, their conversations carrying in the evening air. Cars rumbled past, and although the school next door wasn't in session, it often held events that brought in groups. The idea of my belongings being dumped out there for everyone to see made my stomach churn. I couldn't let it happen. Summoning every ounce of courage, I reacted on instinct. My legs moved before I had time to think, carrying me toward her with a speed I didn't know I possessed. She was already at the gate, her grip firm on my clothes, and I knew I only had seconds to act. When I reached her, I didn't dare touch her. I wouldn't have, but I lunged for the pile of clothes in her arms. My fingers locked around the bundle, gripping so tightly that my muscles burned with the effort. My breath came in sharp bursts as I tried to pull them back toward me, every fiber of my being willing her to let go. I was determined to stop her, desperate to hold onto the last shred of dignity I had left. But my attempt to take control only enraged her further. She spun around abruptly, her face contorted with fury. Her reaction was so swift, I had no time to brace myself. She let go of the clothes and seized me instead. Before I could process what was happening, I felt the sharp, searing pain of her teeth sinking into my back. The first bite sent a jolt of shock through me. It burned like a hot iron pressed against my skin. Then came another, and another. Each one was deliberate, each bite carving into me like a weapon meant to wound. The pain was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was raw, primal, and consuming. It wasn't just my skin she was trying to scar. It felt like she wanted to brand her anger onto my very soul. I twisted and thrashed, desperate to escape, but her grip was unrelenting. Her hands clamped onto me like iron. Her attacks were relentless. Each bite was a reminder of the power she wielded in that moment. Through the chaos, I heard a voice. A sharp, urgent cry broke through the fog of my fear. A woman stood in her doorway, her silhouette frozen in horror as she shouted my mother's name. "Let her go! Let her go!" Her words cut through the nightmare like a lifeline, anchoring me in the moment. But they weren't enough to stop her. The biting continued. Each new wave of pain left me feeling more trapped, as though I were caught in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. With a surge of adrenaline, I finally broke free. My chest heaved as I stumbled back, trembling, my body alive with pain. Every bite throbbed like a pulse, radiating heat and fury. In that moment, I stopped thinking about who she was to me. The word mother felt alien, distant. All that remained was the pain, the searing, burning pain, and the anger that surged from somewhere deep inside me, hot and uncontrollable. As I turned to run, I caught her gaze. Her eyes were blazing with fury. I couldn't take another bite. The searing pain in my back was unbearable, radiating through my body like a fire that wouldn't go out. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't calculated or premeditated. It wasn't even a conscious decision. It was pure instinct, a desperate reaction born from excruciating pain and years of unspoken anguish. Before I realized what I was doing, I spun around. My fist connected with her face, the force of the action reverberating through me. The shock of what I had done hit me instantly. I had never raised a hand to her before, never imagined I would. But in that moment, the pain, the betrayal, and the overwhelming weight of injustice surged through me unstoppable. Somewhere in the background, the woman's voice, the neighbor who had tried to intervene, broke through the chaos. "I told you to let her go." They hovered there, too late, too soft. I was hurt. I was furious. And for the first time, I felt completely severed from my own mother. The pain wasn't just physical. It shattered something deep within me, something I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. Time seemed to freeze. My hand remained clenched, trembling, my entire body shaking with the intensity of the moment. I stared at her, stunned by what I had done. This was my mother, the woman who had brought me into this world, the one who should have protected me. And now, I had struck her in anger. The weight of that realization hit me like a tidal wave, pulling me under with guilt and disbelief. I was 18 years old, still in my final year of high school. How had it come to this? That question hung heavy in my mind, each word cutting like a blade. Anger, pain, betrayal, and beneath it all, a deep, unrelenting sadness that seemed to settle in my very bones. Reflection. In the days and weeks that followed, I replayed that moment in my mind over and over again. Each time, it felt like a fresh wound tearing open, one I didn't know how to close. I struggled to reconcile the image of myself, a daughter striking her mother, with the person I believed I was. Yet I couldn't dismiss the pain that had led me to that breaking point. The physical wounds on my back healed quickly, but the emotional scars lingered, heavy and unrelenting. The bites, though painful, were fleeting, but the ache in my heart felt infinite, as though it had etched itself into my very being. I found myself wrestling with the same unanswerable questions. Was it my fault? Was it hers? Or was this the inevitable result of years of unspoken pain and unresolved conflict rising to the surface? In my confusion, I turned to Scripture, seeking the solace I had found many times before. Proverbs 15 verse 1 spoke to me. A gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. But what happens when gentleness is met with fury? I had not answered harshly. I had not provoked. Yet anger still consumed the room, swallowing any chance for peace. Psalm 34 verse 18 also became a lifeline. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. In the depths of my pain, I clung to the promise that God saw me, even when I struggled to see myself clearly. I reminded myself that He understood my heartache, even when I couldn't make sense of it. Another verse that resonated deeply was Romans 12 verse 21. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Those words became my anchor, a beacon of hope that reminded me I had the power to rise above the darkness, no matter how overwhelming it felt. Looking back, I see that moment not just as a source of pain, but as a turning point, a catalyst that forced me to confront the fractures in my relationship with my mother and ultimately with myself. It was through that confrontation that I began to grasp the true weight of forgiveness, not just for others, but for myself as well. The journey has been anything but easy, and it's one I am still navigating. Yet I've come to understand this. Even in our darkest moments, there is always hope. Even when we feel broken, we are never beyond repair. And even when the people we love hurt us, there is a path to healing, one that begins with grace, understanding, and unshakable faith. The breaking point. The scene had spiraled far beyond anything I could have imagined. My clothes were strewn across the yard, tossed out like garbage, my dignity crushed under a wave of humiliation. The biting incident had already left me bruised, aching, and shaken. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my mother rush back into the house. Her steps were quick and deliberate, charged with purpose. It was the kind of movement that sends a chill down your spine. It signaled danger before your mind could fully catch up. I didn't know what she was about to do, but every instinct in me screamed to get ready. Seconds later, she reappeared, gripping a machete in her hand. Panic surged through me, cold, raw, and more intense than anything I had ever felt. I bolted toward the neighbor's house, shoving her out of the doorway as I stumbled inside. She had been standing there, frozen, watching everything unfold, unable or unwilling to step in. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking. But how much protection could a simple lock offer against her rage? The image of her standing there, the machete glinting in the light, is burned into my memory. It wasn't just a weapon, it was her rage made manifest, aimed squarely at me. Her eyes were locked on the front door, scanning for an entry point. When she realized the door was locked, she turned her attention to the window. My heart pounded as I heard her raise the machete high before it crashed down against the aluminum panes. Clang, clang. Each strike reverberated through the room like a death knell, relentless and unyielding. The window didn't shatter, but it buckled and twisted under the pressure. It couldn't hold much longer. Inside the small room, the air felt heavy and suffocating. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. Outside, her voice cut through the noise of metal against glass, rising in anger, laced with curses, her words curling into the night like smoke. Then, in a moment so strange it felt unreal, she lifted her breasts to the sky and shouted, "Lord, you see these breasts that this child suck." The sound of her words hit me like a dark chant, thick with malice and accusation. It was as if she was summoning something evil, something that wanted to crush me beneath its weight. I sat in a chair, feet dangling, knees pressed tight, hands trembling. My mind spun with questions that had no answers. What do I do? How does this end? I was 18, technically an adult, yet I had never felt so small or powerless. I just wanted it to stop. I wanted to be safe. The call for help. That's when the idea struck me. Call the police. The station was within walking distance. I knew that in Jamaica, a mother-daughter dispute rarely led to arrests, but I wasn't looking for anyone to be jailed. I just needed the chaos to stop, even if only for a moment. I hoped their presence would de-escalate the situation enough to let me leave the room unharmed. If nothing else, their arrival might buy me time to breathe and think clearly. With trembling hands, I made the call. My voice wavered as I spoke, carefully choosing my words. I couldn't tell them exactly what was happening. I couldn't risk them dismissing it as just another family matter. Instead, I lied. There's a war going on up the road, I said, my voice unsteady. It wasn't true, but I needed them to come. If I'd said, my mother is beating me, I feared they wouldn't take it seriously enough to respond. I didn't need them to arrest her. I just needed their presence to help me get out of the tenant's house. As I waited, I could still hear her rage outside, her voice cutting through the walls like a blade. The neighbor who had watched earlier from her doorway remained a witness. She stayed there still. She offered no comfort, no intervention. Then I heard footsteps. Relief coursed through me as I realized the police had arrived. They didn't approach with sirens blaring or guns drawn. Instead, they moved with measured calm, as though they'd been called to scenes like this many times before. Slowly, I unlocked the door and stepped outside. My mother met them first. She was already speaking by the time they reached her, her words pouring out in a rapid stream of justifications. She didn't pause for breath, her tone insistent, determined to make them see things her way. The officers listened intently, their expressions neutral. She's stubborn, my mother interjected before I could answer. Every question they asked was met with the same refrain. I was stubborn. The officer closest to me leaned in slightly and issued a quiet warning. Don't be stubborn. His voice was calm, almost measured, as if he were trying to walk a fine line. It wasn't the tone of someone accusing me. It felt more like an attempt to diffuse tension, to stop things from spiraling further. He didn't seem convinced I was at fault. From the way he carried himself and the careful neutrality in his words, it appeared he was trying to stop her from repeating the accusation, hoping to defuse the situation. I stayed silent. Anything I said would have been pointless. She had already constructed her version of the story, one that placed me as the villain. I could feel the futility of speaking up. My words would have fallen into the cracks of her narrative, unheard and unwelcome. The officers weren't truly calming her. They were questioning her instead. I could tell they were trying to piece together the dynamic between us. Their questions, such as, why did she grow up with her grandmother, hinted at what they might have been thinking. It was almost as if they sensed a trace of rejection from her toward me. Still, I was oddly relieved that their focus was on her and not me. At least the machete was no longer in her hands. At least for now she had stopped. Breaking free, but not quite. After the police left, fear still clung to me. I had told them I couldn't stay, but they insisted there was no other choice. Their departure left me with a hollow sense of security, empty and fleeting. They seemed to believe their presence would be enough to stop my mother from hurting me again. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Nothing had changed. Nothing ever would. I stepped back into the house, my body still shaking, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on me like a heavy cloak. The anger and fear I had felt moments before began to twist into something else, guilt. I thought of what I had done. I needed to make it right. I went to the kitchen, warmed some water, and gently anointed the spot where I had struck her. My words spilled out in a rush, each one laced with regret. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have hit you. I was wrong. I'm so sorry. I kept repeating the words, trying to erase what I'd done, trying to mend something that felt irreparably broken. And then something I never expected happened. Her anger, so sharp and constant, cracked. It was as if a dam had burst, releasing something raw and unfiltered. But what came next wasn't peace or resolution. Instead, it was pain, her pain, pouring out in disjointed fragments, each one cutting through the air like jagged glass. Someone once accused me of putting poison in soup, she said, her voice trembling with something between bitterness and sorrow. Her words struck me like a slap, sudden and stinging. I couldn't help but remember the day she accused me of putting something in her tea. The memory resurfaced with startling clarity, sharp and raw, as though it had happened yesterday. Inside, I cried at the injustice of it. I had never done such a thing, and the accusation had cut deep, leaving a wound I wasn't sure would ever heal. As she spoke now, her voice dipping into memories of her own past, I heard stories I hadn't fully grasped before. She told me about her poverty, how she had gone to job interviews without proper clothes to wear. For the first time, I saw how much those experiences had shaped her, and more disturbingly, how much she seemed to want me to endure the same. It was as if she believed that only through suffering would I truly understand her pain. Or worse, she wanted me to become a reflection of it. The realization settled over me like a heavy weight. It explained so much. The way she treated me, the way she justified her cruelty. My suffering, in her eyes, was not just inevitable. It was necessary, a continuation of her story. But even as I began to understand her truth, I felt the sharp sting of its unfairness. I didn't deserve this. I didn't deserve to be a mirror for her pain. That moment felt like a wave crashing over me, leaving me gasping for air. I knew, with a certainty I had never felt before, that I couldn't keep living under her roof. I couldn't keep subjecting myself to the abuse, the accusations, the endless cycle of anger and hurt. Something had to change. For the first time, I started to see the twisted pattern beneath everything. How the pain she had endured had hardened her and made her incapable of showing love the way I so desperately needed. The tension between us had been building for years, until finally it reached its breaking point. Years of emotional neglect, harsh words, and physical abuse had worn me down. Despite my deep longing for her love and approval, I had learned to expect only cruelty in return. But this day, this moment, was different. It wasn't just another fight. It wasn't just another wound. It was the final straw, the one that would force me to make a life-altering decision. Reactions that revealed the hidden tensions. As the sting of what had just happened settled into both my skin and my heart, I became aware of the older neighbor who lived in the yard. I hadn't seen her during the altercation, but it was clear she knew what had happened. Either she had witnessed everything, or she heard about it afterward. That moment is a little faint in my mind. When the dust began to settle, she spoke, her voice sharp and cutting. "Serve her right," she said, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. I froze. Was she happy? I didn't know how to respond, or even how to feel in that moment. Shame and anger churned inside me, twisting together in a way that left me unsteady. And yet, here she was, almost reveling in what had just happened. Her words lingered, replaying in my mind like an unwelcome echo. It made me wonder how much of my mother's behavior had seeped into the lives of the people around us, affecting them in ways I had never noticed before. Were they witnesses to her cruelty too? Were they cheering because they understood, or because they didn't? Later that day, when my stepfather came home and learned about the incident, his reaction was even more unsettling. I braced myself for scolding, for anger, for some kind of consequence. Instead, he surprised me. His voice carried an air of calm satisfaction. "Serve her right," he said, echoing the neighbor's words, as if my retaliation had been some form of overdue justice. I stared at him, stunned. Was this how he really felt? His response cracked open something I had long suspected, but hadn't dared to confront. The dynamics of our household, the simmering tension, the silence, the unspoken alliances were more complicated than I could have imagined. The responses of both my neighbor and my stepfather left me deeply unsettled. On one hand, their reactions gave me an odd sense of validation, as if my mother's behavior had not gone unnoticed, as if someone somewhere understood what I had endured. But on the other hand, it only deepened the confusion and pain already swirling inside me. I didn't want anyone to cheer for what had happened. This wasn't justice. I didn't feel victorious. I felt broken. The incident at church. Not long after the confrontation at home, my mother and I went to church. Her face was still swollen, the evidence of what had happened impossible to ignore. Sitting stiffly in the pews, I felt the weight of the incident pressing between us, heavy and unspoken. I tried to focus on the service, on the hymns and the prayers, but my thoughts kept circling back to what had happened. After the service ended, the pastor approached my mother, her concern evident. "What happened to your face?" she asked gently. My mother's response was quick, almost rehearsed. "A ball hit me," she said, brushing it off. For a fleeting moment, I thought that might be enough to end the conversation. But then she hesitated, and before I could even prepare myself, she told the truth. My daughter thumped me in the face. The room seemed to exhale all at once, the air shifting as her words landed. It was as if the walls themselves absorbed her story, leaving me exposed. No one knew the full truth. The biting argument, the frustration that had been simmering for years, the impossible tension that had finally erupted. They only knew that a daughter had struck her mother, and to them, that was all that mattered. I stood there, struggling to steady my breathing, my chest tight with a toxic mix of shame, frustration, and helplessness. I could feel the weight of their unspoken judgments settling on my shoulders. In that moment, I understood how a single act, torn from its context, could overshadow everything else. It didn't matter what had led to this or what I had endured. All they saw was the swollen face of a mother and the silent figure of her daughter. The pastor often visited our home, so it wasn't unusual for her to come by afterward. But this time, everything felt different. Knowing that others were now aware of what had happened, even though they only had a fragment of the truth, made the strained dynamics of our relationship even harder to bear. The final decision. That same week, our pastor and a few church members came to visit. My mother put on her best performance, slipping into the role of the victim with practiced ease. I wasn't allowed to speak. I moved around the yard in silence, as she painted me as the aggressor. The visitors looked at me with pity, their disappointment evident in their eyes. Once, that look would have crushed me. But now, I felt nothing. I had made up my mind. I couldn't live here any longer. The pastor eventually turned her attention to me, addressing my mother with a quiet concern. "What's her plan? Where is she going?" she asked, her expression soft but searching. My mother's tone changed instantly, becoming sweet and measured for their benefit. "I don't know where she's going," she said, shaking her head with feigned innocence. Her voice carried just the right mix of worry and resignation, a performance meant to shield her from blame. But as soon as their backs were turned, her mask slipped. Her face hardened, and her words came cold and clipped. "You better come out," she said. That moment solidified everything for me. Her tone was the final confirmation. The door to my childhood, and everything it represented, had closed for good. I had no choice but to leave. Police incident and leaving at 18. Even after everything, when I apologized and tried to make peace, my mother never acknowledged her role in the abuse. She refused to take responsibility, choosing instead to deny the harm she had caused. Her silence, her refusal to own what she had done, cut deeper than any words could have. Though my mother's abuse continued, I found an inner strength I hadn't known I possessed. I leaned on my church and the few supportive people in my life, including my Bible school principal, whose guidance became a lifeline. While I didn't have access to traditional therapy, the counsel I received during those moments of vulnerability gave me the clarity and resilience I needed to rebuild myself. Slowly but surely, I began to grow stronger piece by piece. Reflection. Reflecting on that moment, I now see the strength it took to apologize to my mother, even though she never acknowledged her role in the pain I endured. My apology wasn't about absolving her or dismissing the abuse. It was about freeing myself from the weight of resentment. Holding on to anger felt like carrying a burden I was never meant to bear. As I walked away from that conversation, I found comfort in the words of Ephesians 4 verses 31 to 32. "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." Forgiveness, I've learned, is not always about reconciliation or expecting change from others. It's about choosing peace for myself. In that moment, I wasn't seeking validation from my mother. I was seeking closure within my own heart. The experience also brought me back to Proverbs 4 verse 23. "Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it." By choosing to let go of bitterness, I was guarding my heart, protecting the future I was working so hard to build. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. It was necessary for my healing and for my hope. Faith, truth, and resilience. Looking back on this experience, I realized that truth has a way of grounding us, even when it feels like it's costing us everything. In moments when deception and favoritism made me feel unseen and unworthy, I held on to my faith as my guide. It wasn't easy. But now, I see how God placed people like my cadet officer in my life. They were small reminders that I wasn't alone. His simple act of kindness became a light in a moment of despair. To anyone reading this who has felt the sting of injustice, or the burden of always doing what's right while others seem to escape accountability, I want you to know this. Your truth matters. It may not be recognized immediately. It may even invite criticism, but it is the foundation of your strength. Faith, honesty, and perseverance have a way of shining light into the darkest situations. Hold on to them. They'll guide you through moments when you feel betrayed, overlooked, or unseen. Even when the odds seem stacked against you, trust that every step forward, rooted in truth and resilience, is building a brighter future. Your journey matters. Your strength can inspire others to find their own. That concludes Chapter 3. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Stay tuned for Chapter 4 in the next video.